we actually find that finance people can very quickly get the message. So logistics is now a strategic enabler as they're trying to go faster. And what a finance person will see very quickly is the value of the equipment that's in transit. And so every day of transit time, every number of minutes cycling through a warehouse or stuck in customs has an enormous cost. The opportunity cost of not deploying hardware is far more than the hardware itself. So, as I say, oddly, we found that finance people can get that message very quickly and can often be the ones pushing for a solution more quickly than ops people. Of course, it varies by customers. Some where the supply chain has had more time to evolve or came from a different part of the business first, maybe more sophisticated. But for some, where building new capacity is both new in the process and the new in the requirement, definitely finance people. On the flip side, and this won't come as a surprise, procurement can quite often be a challenge. Of course, they're doing their job, which is to drive down cost to serve. Hi, it's Keith Young here, VP of Data Center Services at Arvato. Delighted to be speaking on the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast today with Joshua.
Hi, it's Joshua Feinberg, host of the Data Center Go-to-Market podcast. And today I'm welcoming a very special guest. Joining me today is Keith Young, who is Vice President of Data Center Services for Arvato, based in Dublin, Ireland. Keith, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you, Joshua. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's a pleasure to have you here as well. Now, you've transitioned from leading a highly successful 45-year-old family-run logistics firm in Ireland to steering a massive global data center footprint with Arvato. For our audience of GTM leaders across data center operators, technology, facilities, construction, real estate, and investment, literally all over the world, what have you found to be the biggest fundamental shift? What's been the biggest change that's happening right now and how hyperscalers view logistics companies like Arvato?
Sure. And maybe to answer that, I might have to go back a step and explain a little bit about the rationale for the acquisition and the transition that you mentioned. So ATC was a company focused exclusively on hyperscalers, serving their logistics needs, whether it was secure transportation or data center technical services in Europe. You mentioned at the start, I'm sitting here in Dublin, and that's where the business began 45 years ago, founded by my parents, and then transitioning around 2027 to me. But at around 2022, we began to realize that even though we had achieved super success growing across Europe, we were a little bit of a bottleneck, that to go further than that, to go global, if you will, was going to take a little bit more firepower. Aided and advised by our board at the time, they said, guys, it's time you really take this seriously. You need to think about changes in market dynamics, about risks your customers may perceive in having a small regional player, and you really need to think about joining a much larger company. So very much our reasons for doing it were partly legacy, of course, for family business, but also because we had an ambition that we wanted to do more, and really an extraordinary pride in our people that helped build the service along that journey. So around 2023, we began the process. It wasn't running at full speed. We were really determined that we would find that larger home where there was a culture fit, where the services were complementary, and where there was also an ambition to get into that space. Luckily, Arvato was already a customer of ours. So we had some inroads, and through some really good conversations and introductions and a lot of getting to know you, we began to see how those things would be complementary. Arvato has been a leader in warehousing and supply chain services for many years. With ATC, we had transportation and then work at the data centers. And almost like pieces of a Lego block, they fit together. So we began life then as part of Arvato, myself and my new role, on the 1st of January 2025. So now back to your question, what was that transition like? For the most part, very good. So immediately we began work on the things we wanted to do, which was our North Star to take these services on a global scale. Very quickly, we began to identify the areas where we would start operating. And then on a more measured and deliberate pace, we began to look about how we could integrate things at home here in Europe. By October last year, we already had our first 2 regions up and running in the US, which was really a fantastic speed, and some consolidation here in Europe. But kind of at an emotional level, which I think is some of the question you were asking, you gain a lot, but you do lose things. So the very high degree of speed and autonomy and flexibility we had moderated slightly as we had some more governance, some more review over decision making, and so on. But on the flip side, what we gained was very substantial investment in the business and global reach and scale. So for those very few small things that were lost, they were worth it 10 times over, because the global scale is exactly where we want to be right now.
We often talk about the data center ecosystem across technology companies, facilities companies, real estate, construction, investors, and of course the operators, expanding into areas where it used to be just land, but now it's land and power, energy availability. You, by nature of being located in Dublin, are in a very similar position to some of the secondary markets in the United States. And when we look at the data center ecosystem expanding into secondary and tertiary markets, how do you see the race for power and space fundamentally changing, and how has it been especially challenging for traditional supply chain models?
So I might just go backwards a little bit. So in our time in ATC, we began working with one of the hyperscalers here in Europe, in Dublin. And then their expansion went to Frankfurt, to London, and to other markets across Europe. That was driven back then not by power, but by having a wider footprint, lower latency to customers, and beginning to enable the cloud transition. So that was very much a first phase of that. And as you say, that's equal to some of the smaller markets in the US. What we've seen since around 2024 is the initial wave of moving to the cloud be completely replaced, indeed eclipsed, by the rush to build out AI compute capacity. Exactly as you say, it's not a race for space anymore, or even latency. A lot of that training can be done far away from the end user. But what we see is that hyperscalers and neoclouds now as well are hoovering up any power that they can get anywhere across Europe, or indeed in the US. So places like Stavanger in Norway, for our listeners in the US, if you imagine that's halfway up along the Norwegian coast, not too far from the Arctic Circle. That places an extraordinary pressure on supply chains. So typically you would not have very sophisticated supply chains that stretch up there with transport links, with warehousing capacity, with all the things that you might need to be able to do things at scale. So as a service provider, what we see is the pressure to do things quickly and at scale, but almost at the limits of traditional physical supply chains. In the US, over the last year, we've seen that trend continue. Data center regions are popping up in places like North Dakota, in Utah, in places that were not the typical markets of Virginia and Texas that were dominant only a few years ago. So it's really dramatically changing the landscape. We're a service provider to the hyperscalers and others, but we also see in the wider ecosystem mechanical and electrical providers, UPS providers, other technical service providers, all on that race to go to these new markets in very far-flung places. So it's a very interesting transition, and it certainly challenges supply chains, because as well as moving at speed, you also have to build in resilience. For these customers now, the speed of their supply chain is becoming a competitive advantage at the same time as they stretch the limits of what was possible only a few years ago.
So it sounds like to a certain degree, the decentralization of the data center industry has been a big opportunity for Arvato.
It certainly has. As you stretch out, just to give a practical example, where in the past you might have hub warehouses that could serve a hero region, you now have to consider hub and spoke models to have materials positioned far closer to data centers. And it also brings other capabilities into scope that may not have been there before. Outside of the US, customs regulations will apply way more than you would see there. So in APAC and EMEA, we see that EOR and IOR capabilities are also vital to get equipment into countries like Switzerland, the UK, Norway at speed. And that's where the warehouses come in, because they provide that resilience by having materials near the data centers so that build-outs and projects don't get delayed. Overall, it is a time of opportunity for us.
Now, ATC spent decades cultivating this hyper-specialized technical logistics capabilities throughout Europe, the white glove delivery, the complex cabling, the precise staging. When Arvato came together with ATC, what was your go-to-market thesis? What was the basic plan you were looking to execute to make all of this work together?
That's a good question, also a complex one. So very much our business was a people business. And even though we're operating within global supply chains, a lot of decisions and a lot of the quick thinking on the ground is what's needed day to day for a project or a delivery, or whatever your unit of measure is to succeed. In our go-to-market strategy, so I'll just take the US as an example. We're very lucky here in Ireland that the US is a very familiar place to us. So we had a body of volunteers who were willing to move and become, each of them, the nucleus of a new team in the US. Common language, common cultural references, and because of Arvato scale, the ability to do this legally within visa frameworks and so on. So go-to-market was really about taking that skill and experience base that you described and then diffusing it across our global footprint. We've definitely put some areas and regions ahead of the others. You can't do everything everywhere all at once, but with some prioritization and with our people really eager to go on this journey with us. It's been relatively straightforward in concept, of course, some challenges incrementally along the way, but so far the process has been a success.
Really interesting to hear you describe the playbook of having your longtime talent that you developed in Ireland move to the US to kick this off, because I remembered in a completely different part of the tech industry, software companies and some of the cloud companies doing the opposite with their first foothold into Europe and Dublin. I remember HubSpot in the mid 2010s had their first hires. They opened up their Dublin office that they ended up calling HubSpot, and their first hires were literally relocating from Cambridge, from Boston, over to Dublin to recruit the initial team. So interesting to see that dynamic working in the other place. But I'm curious too with hyperscalers. It's so concentrated compared to selling to colocation operators. They're notorious for wanting that single point of contact, that one throat to choke, especially when it comes to logistics and supply chain, or just a single global partner, as they might more safely express. How does having that one dedicated key account manager change the sales conversation when it comes to bidding on these massive digital infrastructure projects?
Again, it's a complex answer. So you're absolutely right. At a global scale, there's a top tier of hyperscalers. They run global supply chains, so your list of decision makers is very small. Across the top 5, it probably numbers no more than 50. So you get to know the names, even though it's often quite difficult to access them. Typically, what we found is when there's a need, like a new region or a requirement to speed up or to add an additional service Just take, for example, rolling out liquid cooling for AI compute. Typically, you get a request. It's always an advantage to mirror your customer structure. So we do operate those global teams with responsibility. So at times it's a one-to-one relationship. Where I say it's more complex than that is all of the trust that goes into those conversations to say, I'm going to pick up the phone to Keith before anyone else, comes from our teams on the ground every day. And that's where trust and operational excellence is the foundation that a business development or an account management team can then thrive on. If you don't have that on the ground, you're not getting that phone call. The other complexity we see is these companies are so busy and in such a race to build out capacity, they're racing with each other to have it, that they very quickly want to hear from operational leaders and SMEs. There are certain non-negotiables, safety, security, etc. And you need to very quickly bring those people into the conversation so they understand that we have the skill base, the breadth of coverage, and the people we can put on the ground very quickly to do it. So at that point, it becomes a relationship and a capability conversation. And that's been one of the more interesting elements that we've seen in this over the years, especially now taking that approach and scaling it.
It's super interesting to hear you bring up the idea of the decision committee at the hyperscalers vetting your team's expertise. And that lines up very well with what we're seeing industry wide, where education and expertise and essentially getting involved in professional development and learning and development for your prospects, for your future clients' business has become a huge, huge part of being able to shape the priorities and align their multiple stakeholders, their decision committee around your best practices and methodologies and purposes and just how you shape the space. So really, really interesting thought process on all of that. I want to shift gears for a few minutes and talk about execution. Now, you recently stood up operations in the Midwest in Des Moines, right, to support one of the world's largest hyperscalers. When you scale an operation from Frankfurt or London or Dublin directly into the American Midwest, what are the primary cultural and logistical frictions that your team had to overcome?
Quite a few. So let's just start with the easiest ones. Getting people there legally and ready to work. I mentioned the team that were willing to move earlier. We were also really lucky that the founder of ATC, so my father, was also keen on seeing that journey come to life. So he provided a huge amount of skills and experience, helping build those initial relationships with the data centers in the Midwest, and then to support it later. But that alone is not enough. So how do you scale the team? And what were those challenges? The first thing we noticed in the US is that there is a different work culture. We were warned about this. Loyalty to employers isn't quite the same as we would see here in Europe, and people are more willing to move jobs and move regions. So our challenge was how to turn that from a disadvantage to an advantage. So part of it was ensuring that we looked after our people. That meant competitive compensation. It also meant setting up a training academy so that they feel they're learning new skills and empowered. And then by virtue of scaling quickly, it also allowed us to give them development opportunities, so a sense of career progression. Within Europe, a lot of my colleagues have migrated across Europe for work. And typically we find in certain countries, which may be a bit more conservative, they may not have jobs that match their skills and experience. So we have always selected people not strictly on skills and experience, but more on attitude and willingness to grow. And one of the things I found over the years is a person who uproots themselves to look for opportunities. If you see that in them and recognize it and then give them an opportunity, that comes back to you in loyalty, in hard work, and you bring someone on board who's going to stay dedicated to the company's mission. We've tried our best and with good success to do that in the US. Some of our initial team that started in the Midwest, and I'm thinking of one person in particular, has already been promoted and now leads a team in San Jose in California. So we've tried to bring some of that kind of respect for people into this process. If you do that, especially in a industry where you're trusting your people to be alongside the customer in their data centers every day, if you trust the people to do that, that comes back as a reward to you later.
So it sounds like one of the more interesting challenges and learnings from all of this is that the competition for talent retention is significantly more intense in the US than you found in Western Europe.
Very much so. Typically, turnover rates in Europe would be far lower. So that does mean competitive compensation. It does mean those development opportunities. It absolutely was a go-to-market challenge in the US, exactly as you say, but not insurmountable.
Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing. BRIEFING. Keith, as we're alluding to a few moments ago, where you were talking about having to demonstrate the expertise of people on your team, we know increasingly buyer education plays a really, really important role in modern sales cycles, where increasingly stakeholders don't want to spend a lot of time with marketing and sales professionals anymore. I often half jokingly, half seriously refer to it as a marketing allergy or a sales allergy, where no matter how good the golf tournament is or the cabana party is or the sports experience, they just don't tend to want to socialize as much with salespeople anymore. But getting in there early enough and shaping the criteria is super important. What role, what playbook have you deployed for Arvato to make sure that you're in early enough with buyer education to shape priorities, especially when you think about how your strategy and leadership gets implemented more tactically at the chief revenue officer, chief commercial officer, sales team, marketing team type of level?
So we have the advantage working across the top 5 hyperscalers of being able to see aspects of each of them that's best practice. And so we take that back into our operations, of course, always respecting privacy and confidentiality. But as we go to a new customer or to talk about a new project, we have insights that can help show them efficiency. So typically, as you say, it's not just a salesperson, but the minute we get our operational leaders in the room and they can look at a process, look at a potential setup for a project and say, yes, but have you thought about this? Or how about this capability that we have within Arvato that could be useful? Whether it's how you organize your customs or your supply chain finance or your warehouse management system. We bring those conversations in, and it's twofold. It's one, buyer education, as you say, but then the second, so building trust that we have the operational excellence and reliability to then go internally and pitch to your CEO or COO, exactly as you say.
Yeah, we have for a while called trust the first cousin of education. Is that in order to get the trust, a huge, huge part of building the trusted brand goes so far beyond just the logo and the colors and the fonts and what was traditionally the realm of a creative director 10 years ago. Trust is now everything that the marketplace says about you when you're not in the room. And the challenge for so many in the data center ecosystem is defining what part of the marketplace that they need the most surface area in. A lot of companies are struggling with very broad market awareness when they need hyper focused. In your particular case, like you indicated, there's 5 accounts and potentially a few dozen people in each of those accounts that really, really matter. With all of this in mind, a lot of the tactical playbook that marketing and sales enablement leaders often think of comes down to content. And content in many ways, whether it's coming through LinkedIn posts or YouTube videos or webinars or review sites, content is often trying to do a lot of different things for achieve a lot of different outcomes, a lot of different goals for a lot of different people. Where have you seen technical content struggle the most when it comes to being able to educate and build trust with the types of stakeholders that are really important on a decision committee for a business like Arvato?
Trying to map out a global supply chain and complex processes can really be a challenge when you try to get that onto slides or into a video. So, or even maybe to make it more concrete, how do you demonstrate your capability or your culture when it comes to safety? So for us, safety is one of our values up there with quality and customer experience. It's you can't in a slide demonstrate that that's lived and breathed every day by your teams on the ground. So kind of back to earning trust and operational excellence, people need to connect with that and they need to live it. It needs to be part of their work. And we find that that message rises through the organization, through the customer organization. And the way we typically feel it is, oh, I've given that project, that assignment, that job to ATC or Arvato. I don't need to worry about it anymore. We won't have a safety challenge. We won't have a security issue. But it takes a really long time then for that message and that trust to bubble upwards through an organization. Quite often people are consumed with whatever the latest escalation is or supply chain crisis, from Suez to COVID to recent conflicts. So it takes a lot of constant reinforcement. Maybe to come back to something more concrete, one of the things that we find really, really works is when our customers come to visit us, or where their senior supply chain people come to visit us in their own data center. Because that's when you see in a warehouse or in a data center these things in the flesh, and then they leave very comfortable. You kind of also talk about technical content, and I want to just go back to the go-to-market for a second. These are very large companies, and while you may have a traditional logistics organization, there's actually multiple parallel organizations that all have logistics requirements. And in some cases, and we see this to varying degrees, joined up thinking in this AI arms race hasn't fully permeated the organization. So quite often you have to work with new teams on a new process. And we find that those connections and bringing solutions from one side of a customer to the other side of the customer is also a really good strategy for us. But as I say, all of that is built on already being reliable. And it's very rarely about that last golf outing or that last barbecue.
When you think about the different kinds of stakeholders that ultimately weigh in, who have you found to be the most productive relationships to invest in, and what are some of the more frustrating or challenging relationships that you've tried to invest in with certain kinds of stakeholders, certain kinds of job functions that are necessary for a successful long-term logistics partnership?
So this answer might be counterintuitive. We actually find that finance people can very quickly get the message. So logistics is now a strategic enabler as they're trying to go faster. And what a finance person will see very quickly is the value of the equipment that's in transit. And so every day of transit time, every number of minutes cycling through a warehouse or stuck in customs has an enormous cost. The opportunity cost of not deploying hardware is far more than the hardware itself. So, as I say, oddly, we found that finance people can get that message very quickly, and can often be the ones pushing for a solution more quickly than ops people. Of course, it varies by customers. Some where the supply chain has had more time to evolve or came from a different part of the business first, maybe more sophisticated. But for some, where building new capacity is both new in the process and the new in the requirement, definitely finance people. On the flip side, and this won't come as a surprise, procurement can quite often be a challenge. Of course, they're doing their job, which is to drive down cost to serve. But sometimes when you want speed and quality, you have to carefully manage what's the fair cost for that. We very much go on the approach that it's important to have the right price.
Really fascinating to hear you zero in on the value of the relationships with the finance executives, because we've heard that so often among the IOR type of business models that are struggling with addressing cross-border type of issues. Also, equally interesting to hear you bring up the frustrations with procurement, because we also hear that throughout data center facilities related organizations, where the feeling is it's not so much that they're order takers, it's that they're being expected to make strategic decisions about categories of products and services that they're just not trained for. And oftentimes the challenge is, in most cases, the go-to-market team didn't establish enough density, enough surface area with the rest of the decision committee, so they're falling back on only meeting this company in the very late stages of the journey. And when they do that, there's no one else advocating for them by default. They're the seventh opinion on the RFP, and their only contact is procurement. So really, really interesting to hear you zero in on the two extremes there.
And in a number of recent examples, you're absolutely right. Procurement has been the last step in the process because it kicked off with operations people who requirements.
Keith, you mentioned something also really interesting with the visits, where you're taking your team to go visit their facilities, or they're coming to visit your facilities. And that aligns really well with another trend that we hear about, how in the post-generative AI world and moving out of the early 2020s, that people are craving FaceTime. But I think in many ways, they're struggling with what is actually the right kind of FaceTime, because for a lot of companies that are so hyper-focused on one small niche, when they're in a broad conference ecosystem environment, they're trying to find one size fits most for 300, 400, 500 different companies and thousands of attendees. So a lot of the playbook that we've been seeing companies migrate towards is going back to basics, with hosting like micro events, breakfast seminars, lunch and learns, very targeted series. But when you talk about a site visit where they're visiting you or you're visiting them, it's targeted just at one particular account. Has that influenced how you think about field marketing and getting enough face time throughout the full journey to shape their criteria?
It certainly has. So micro events is absolutely what we focused on over the last few years. So while it's great to go to the large scale supply chain conferences, most of your customers are there, most of your competitors are there, quite often partners are there. That's great just for general networking and catching up. I don't think, especially in our world, a lot of business actually takes place there, but you keep relationships fresh and alive. Micro events where you might have 30 to 60 people allow you to go into a lot more depth, have a lot more focused conversations. But as I said, we found some of the most powerful types of events are when we bring a group of people, typically one customer, to our site, or where you might have a logistics team or supply chain team going to visit a data center itself and seeing services in action. In a warehouse, that could be seeing what type of automation is possible in the future, how a warehouse is organized, how quickly you can turn equipment in and out, how you handle bonded storage and so on. And very much, and maybe it is a post-COVID thing, that you feel like you want to touch it. Like that's a server rack, or that's a pallet of high-speed cables, and you want to see how quickly that moves. So I think people who may often be decision makers and far away from the action, they're also craving actually being able to put their hands on the equipment that they're spending hundreds of millions of dollars moving. And so very much we focus on small, intimate even visits to their sites or ours as a way of demonstrating capability.
What fascinates me as well as host of a podcast about go-to-market issues is you mentioned the value of having a relationship with the finance executive on the client side. But I imagine from time to time there's interesting conversations with your own CFO as well, because if you look at the amount of investment that's required to really, really saturate national and global conferences, the expenditures, especially if you're doing this at the scale of twice a month, 25, 30 times a year, can be staggering. Whereas the micro events, the cost is usually extraordinarily low.
How do I answer that? Yes, that cost is extraordinarily low. I don't think our marketing budget is especially huge. I hope my colleagues don't have a heart attack hearing me say that. Um, Actually, the true cost comes in pulling operations people for a day to plan it, a day to host it. Like that's the real cost rather than a monetary one. But you mentioned, a conversation with the CFO and investment and so on. I think one of the things we do well is reinvest in the business. Typically, a very high single-digit number each year. I believe it's more than in the industry. Warehousing, transportation, automation, these things are expensive. One of the advantages I feel we have is when we go with an investment proposal to our CFO and our CEO, there is a faith in this industry that all the signals are there that for the next few years, this is a place to be. This is an area that's interesting, exciting. It's going to satisfy our business strategy. And so we found that the willingness to invest is very high. Of course, they have to be the correct investments, correctly costed. Very much it's focused on this being an industry of the future.
When I speak with sales leaders or even account executives and directors, a lot of the frustration is they feel like they're not getting in early enough to really shape the journey, shape the criteria. And by the time they get looped in, it's many times too late. So we have a lot of the same conversation that I was just alluding to with thinking about repositioning account executives, account managers, sales development reps to be seen a lot more like teachers and consultants and subject matter experts, trusted advisors. The more seasoned people on your team may be even seen like thought leaders. And the playbook with that a lot of times is shockingly so straightforward that a lot of times people are in disbelief that it can be so simple. Because if you're fortunate enough that your customers are located nearby and you already have a classroom and you already have a conference room and they're 12 hot button issues for the year and you want to have an excuse for them to spend an hour with you once a month, you're not really paying to rent that classroom or conference room. It's in your own facility. Mm-hmm. Breakfast or lunch compared to bringing them to a hotel or a conference center when you're hosting it in your own facility is almost trivial. You likely already have an email marketing program, a CRM program that's feeding this whole demand. What is the blind spot that's tripping up so many sales leaders and professionals from recognizing that this struggle that's been accelerated by generative AI tools, where a lot of technical stakeholders would rather talk to Copilot or Claude or Gemini or ChatGPT than they would having a conversation with a human? Why are so many sales organizations still seeing this blind spot and not adjusting to what generative AI has done to buying cycles?
A few things in there, and maybe I'll just go back to the start of your question. One of the things we experience is that a logistics team or supply chain team is often the last to know about something. All too often, we've heard from our customers that they read about a new data center region when it appears on LinkedIn or someone leaks a permit approval. Part of that is the speed the companies are working at, but also choosing your locations and getting power and all the things we talked about earlier. Those, again, are competitive advantages. So by the time the logistics team or supply chain team knows that they need to act, the window to act has already dramatically shortened. So they're going to lean on people that they know can do it. So that's one of the things we've seen. Typically, then with scalers, that means they're not asking Copilot or Gemini or whoever, hey, can you find me a secure transportation provider in Malaysia? Instead, they pick up the phone to their established and trusted contact. The other thing is, and I can't really speak to this other than just to observe that I agree with you. We have seen, as we've looked at even our own website, our own SEO, that advertising market is changing, that SEO is giving way to optimizing for AI. So instead of keywords, it's having complex, detailed, technical texts that an LLM can digest and understand, and then respond to a query it gets from whomever. So that's a change, and I think we're still quite early in that. However, for our main customers, it comes back to it being a sales cycle. It's I have a need and I need it now, and I know that you can do it. So help.
So in a lot of ways, we're sensing that if people are getting analyst grade type of recommendations from these LLM tools, and historically in larger marketing organizations, there's always been someone whose job was analyst relations. Is there going to be in the near future someone whose job it is to have LLM relations? Be a little different, but is it this same basic idea? Is that or do you feel that there's enough buyers that will continue to bypass these modern tools and lean 100% on their legacy relationships?
I think at least in the next few years, people will continue, at least in that top tier of hyperscalers, to lean on their relationships. They're looking for speed, scale, global reach. But I would see over the next 5 to 10 years that the type of skills you're looking for in people coming into your business are exactly as you say, AI natives. We see that with some of our new younger colleagues. Next week, we're launching an AI initiative across the business to bring people to that AI native level. So I think that will change. It's probably too early to imagine exactly what it's going to look like and how much AI will shape the specifics of day-to-day in a sales cycle. Well, I think the safest thing to do is expect that the changes could in time be quite dramatic.
Keith, the final area that I want to get your thoughts on today is when you look at the core third-party logistics model that Arvato is known for globally, what do you think the future of leading the data center business for Arvato is going to look like when you look ahead into your crystal ball with a 12, 18, maybe 24-month time horizon from now? What's going to change and what do you think will stay the same?
So some of this is optimistic, I have to say, or ambitious. So I very much see our global footprint changing and expanding. In particular, we see in APAC, data center regions are going to new countries. Some continents not yet on the roadmap that may appear because they'll have power advantages in the future. So I'd say like the breadth of what global scope is going to increase and change quite dramatically. I think the size of our organization will naturally increase. It's something we're actively working on, building our talent bench so that we can continue to scale and support customers. Some of the things that are unknown is will that push to new regions moderate a little bit and come back to more established ones, and then fully the impact of AI. We hear that many different roles and levels of roles could be made obsolete. Still, I think it's quite early to say if that's true or not, or if new roles will open up and AI natives drop into them. But definitely, the things I see and expect is global scope global scale, and you have both the challenges of growing your own organization at the same time as growing your capability for the customer. And often those can be in tension, so you have to manage that quite carefully. So it certainly will not be a boring few years.
I think in a lot of ways too, with starting and developing this competency throughout the much more complex, fragmented European Union, where you're dealing with so many different localization issues that you don't have to deal with in the US. Perhaps one of the biggest chapters are already a strong core competence of Arvato going forward.
Yeah, and even so, as I moved into the Arvato world, we had set up in 10 different countries. So we had some experience with it. Great to arrive into an organization that already had a much larger footprint. But I do see that that's a skill and capability we'll need to hone as we go even further across the globe.
And APAC and
quite often,
LATAM and yeah.
Exactly. And the regulatory requirements, the observance of rule of law, all of these things will come more onto the radar as we go to more interesting and exotic places.
Keith, this has been really fascinating to get a window into how you are growing into a global organization and the lessons that you learned along the way with building ATC and how this is unfolding in real time as you grow your footprint among the 5 big hyperscalers and the complex dynamics of what they're looking for from a company like Arvato. If someone wants to follow what you're working on, learn more about you, learn more about Arvato, is LinkedIn a good place to start?
Always the best place to start, yes.
Okay. We'll include links to your LinkedIn profile and the company page and your website along with the show notes. So for anyone that is curious to learn more or potentially reach out, they'll have the contact information right there, front and center. But really appreciate you joining me today, Keith. I've been speaking with Keith Young, who is the VP of Data Center Services for Arvato. Keith is headquartered out of Dublin. Arvato works globally. Thanks so much for joining me, Keith. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Joshua. It was a pleasure.
Likewise. Most data center GTM teams are flying completely blind. 83% of your buyer's journey is happening before they even speak with someone from your sales team. The Data Center Go-to-Market podcast is powered by DCSMI. We've studied over 1,900 industry leaders to build a diagnostic framework that identifies exactly why deals fall apart and revenue stalls. Stop guessing and start benchmarking. Subscribe now to our weekly Data Center GTM briefing at www.dcsmi.com/briefing. Again, that's dcsmi.com/briefing, BRIEFING.